My name's Julia Gregg. I was the independent chair for this review, which, as Simone just said, was jointly commissioned as a safeguarding adult review and domestic abuse related death review concerning Samantha, which is a pseudonym that we gave to the person that died. So in today's session, we've got about an hour and a half. I'm going to take you through the findings from the review. If we have time, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. But what I might suggest is if you want to put your questions in the chat so that if we do run out of time, we can answer those after the session and then circulate them to everybody. Again, as Simone mentioned, that the session is being recorded and that will be available at a later date on the Cumbria Safeguarding Adult Board website. So yeah, just to start with, just to give you a bit of an overview about who Samantha was. She was 33 years of age when she died, and she died in July 2025. At the time, she was living in Cumbria with her partner James and his father. And it was on a day in July 25 that an ambulance was called for Samantha with reports that she was unresponsive and had taken a turn for the worse. On arrival, the paramedics immediately commenced CPR and then took her to hospital, where she sadly died later that day. The coroner ruled that her death was caused by the aspiration of gastric contents, which was secondary to the consumption of drugs. So Samantha had care and support needs, and both she and James reported that James was her carer, her informal carer. They'd been in a relationship with each other since Samantha was the age of 16. She had a history of substance use and mental health issues, which included depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And these, along with other physical health issues that she experienced, affected her ability to carry out her day-to-day activities. Samantha had also reported that James had introduced her to serious drug use, and there had been some concerns about their relationship, which dated back to about 2010. As I said, Samantha had numerous health needs, including deep vein thrombosis, anemia, and some renal issues. But she found it really difficult to engage with professionals, and so her health needs were often left untreated, leading to further deterioration and causing her some significant pain. So when we undertook the review, as well as considering what we knew about Samantha's background history, we very much focused on the 2 years leading up to her death. On the Cumbria SAB website, you'll be able to find, I'm not sure, Simone, if it's published as yet, but I think we have the learning briefing at least, but in the full report you will find in time the full chronology of what occurred during those 2 years, which is obviously too long for me to go into now. But in terms of the findings from this review, they fell under the main themes of risk assessment, safeguarding adults at risk, multi-agency forums, coercive and controlling behaviour, carers who cause harm, making decisions, and trauma-informed approaches. So I'll take you through each of those one by one with some more detail about what we found. So in terms of risk assessment, I actually identified some really good practice that was shown by professionals when assessing domestic abuse risk. They demonstrated that they applied professional judgment to that risk assessment, whereas it's quite common just to go through the questions on a dash, tick them, and look at what the visible risk is. And in this case, that was only a standard risk. But by the professionals applying their professional judgment and saying, hold on a minute, this is clearly high risk, meant that there was a referral onto MARAC, which enabled that multi-agency discussion. So in December 23, Samantha had disclosed physical and financial abuse by James, and she described behaviour that was considered coercive and controlling. There was again really good practice shown by the hospital, who referred Samantha onto housing, and they provided immediate emergency accommodation to her. And bearing in mind this was over the Christmas period, but in the weeks leading up to that Christmas shutdown period, housing had made arrangements to ensure that there was an empty property available in case there was a domestic abuse victim presenting during that time. Samantha wouldn't disclose to police who her partner was, so domestic report could not be generated and no dash was completed by the police. This ultimately led to the crime being filed as no further action due to that perceived lack of support that Samantha was providing. But the police did reflect that once James had been identified at a later date, there was sufficient suspicion in order to arrest him. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, and the apparent reason being that it was a very new officer who was dealing with the matter at the time, and so police took some learning away from that. As I said, due to the Christmas closure period at that particular time, this affected the onward referrals, risk assessments, which were delayed until offices reopened for many services on the 2nd of January. It also resulted in a 1-month delay between referral to MARAC and the MARAC actually taking place. And although we didn't think that this would have had a significant impact on Samantha specifically, we recognised that that delay might have a significant impact on other high-risk victims of domestic abuse. So we really need to recognise that those pressure points that occur throughout the year on services, and make sure that we emphasise to agencies that they need to be proactively safety planning rather than waiting for a MARAC to occur. There were other risk assessments, other types of risk assessments undertaken over that 2-year period. For example, there was a mortality risk assessment undertaken by substance use services that aims to identify individuals who are at heightened risk of drug-related death. But there was a concern that through those other risk assessments, the links between the various risk factors for Samantha were not always clearly identified and linked together. For example, the interplay between substance misuse and domestic abuse is really significant. People who use illicit drugs are 3 times more likely to have reported being a victim of domestic abuse. Men who use substances commit more intimate partner violence than men who don't use any substances. And where drugs and alcohol are involved in domestic abuse, much of the evidence suggests that it's not the root cause, but it's a compounding factor, and sometimes to a significant extent. So it's really, really important to make those links between the various factors at play. Also to add that whilst drug and alcohol use is included as one of the questions in the DASH risk assessment, thus recognising it as a high risk factor, it has been suggested that that question doesn't really do justice to the potential significance of drug and alcohol problems in domestic abuse. We know that some people use substances to self-medicate to manage that psychological effects of domestic abuse. But equally, some perpetrators use substance use as a means to control their victims, which then increases the victim's dependence on the perpetrator, and that was really apparent in Samantha's case. But just to say that there was some really good practice shown in terms of sharing the risk assessments that were completed between the different professionals that were working with Samantha. So moving on to safeguarding adults at risk. So there were 3 safeguarding concerns raised for Samantha over the two-year period. One in December 2023, another one in May 24, and one a month later in June 24. The first 2 concerns that were raised in December 23 and May 24 were not progressed to safeguarding inquiries, and that decision was made on the basis that Samantha didn't have any care and support needs. The rationale also referred to the fact that the police had investigated the allegations that had been made, and that the case had been referred and was going to be heard at MARAC. But it's really important to say that those other mechanisms, the police investigations and MARAC, are not a substitute for safeguarding procedures to be undertaken. That duty still remains for the local authority. In the view of the review, the duty to make a safeguarding inquiry was met. Samantha did have care and support needs. That was by virtue of her substance use and her health issues that affected her ability to manage those day-to-day activities and tasks, as well as to access services. And that clearly put her at increased risk of abuse and exploitation by James. There was that clear evidence that she was experiencing abuse and that she would be unlikely to be able to protect herself from that abuse. So there were some missed opportunities to try and safeguard Samantha at an earlier stage. But it's important to say that, you know, on receipt of a safeguarding concern, adult social care are wholly reliant on the referrer being able to clearly convey what a person's vulnerabilities and potential care and support needs are, regardless of whether or not they're receiving any care and support services to meet those needs. The safeguarding concern that was raised in June 24 was progressed to a safeguarding inquiry, although we weren't really clear about why there was a sudden move within a month from not progressing to progressing. During that inquiry, there were numerous attempts to meet with Samantha, but unfortunately these were all unsuccessful, and she died before contact could be made. Moving on to multi-agency forums. So the primary multi-agency forum used in this case was the MARAC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, which is for the highest risk domestic abuse cases. In that meeting, the professionals sit round, they share all the relevant information they hold about the victim, they discuss what options there are for increasing safety, for minimising risk, and they should create a coordinated action plan to help achieve that increase in safety and minimisation of risk. So the primary focus is to safeguard the adult victim, but they also make links in terms of any other children or vulnerable adults that require safeguarding, and also should be looking to manage the perpetrator's behaviour as well. So at the heart of the MARAC is that assumption that no single agency or individual can see the complete picture, we've seen this in a lot of other reviews, that everybody has a piece of the puzzle, but it's only when you come together and share that information that you have that complete, hopefully complete picture. There was some criticism about that month delay of the referral for MARAC reaching an actual MARAC, and as I've mentioned before, that was primarily due to that Christmas and New Year period, and then the knock-on effect of the backlog that creates in referrals. And I think whilst sorry, I haven't been clicking up my slides. Whilst a lot of agencies consider MARAC to be a really effective forum, I think others might feel that there's too much weight given to MARAC. It's not a golden bullet, it can't possibly solve everything, and whilst MARACs in Cumberland are held on a weekly basis, as some of you may know, there's a really limited time allotted to discuss each case. It's sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most to discuss each case. So it's clearly not a replacement for ongoing multi-agency coordination, approaches, and using other frameworks that are available, which can be used in addition to MARAC and outside of MARAC. The actions agreed at MARAC for Samantha very much focused on gathering more information, but we found that there wasn't really a sense of what the plan was once that information had been gathered. What did that mean once we got an answer to a question? Where was that going to be taken? Where was that going to go? And the actions didn't really appear to meaningfully or explicitly seek to reduce that risk to Samantha or hold James to account for his actions. There are in some localities areas have developed what is sometimes known as a complex MARAC or a MARAC plus, which are for cases that repeatedly come to the notice of MARAC, or cases where there are that additional level of complexity and vulnerability for the victims, where maybe there needs to be a higher level of agency strategic oversight, more time given to discussion and action planning. Cumberland don't have a MARAC plus or a complex MARAC. This may have been beneficial in Samantha's case, given her multiple disadvantage and her vulnerabilities. But regardless of that, it just again highlights that need for using other multi-agency frameworks or convening professionals meetings to discuss these issues in more depth. Safe Lives have also developed some guidance for MARACs around managing cases involving substance use and other complex needs, and I've provided a link to that in the resources at the end of this presentation. But one of the things that they recommend is that MARACs consider a professionals meeting as an action for MARAC, so that it brings together all the relevant agencies to work together as a multidisciplinary team. As I discussed earlier, the safeguarding framework was available in this case. The matter wasn't progressed to an inquiry until June 24, which was 1 month before Samantha's death. And there were, despite the inquiry being triggered, there were some missed opportunities to bring all those agencies together for a multi-agency discussion, particularly when those attempts to contact Samantha had been unsuccessful. But aside from that, outside of those forums and frameworks, there was some really good evidence of multi-agency working. But there were also reports of information being received by the various agencies, either third or fourth hand. Information wasn't always shared in a timely way, and some information was actually received after Samantha's death. The agencies that received information were often unclear about who was acting on what. I suppose it's that sort of scattergun approach of sharing information far and wide, but you're not really sure if that's emails for you to action or it's just for information. So there was that lack of coordination around Samantha and in terms of who was doing what and what was everybody's role and remit. Excuse me. So moving on to coercive controlling behaviour. A crime of coercive controlling behaviour was not recorded in relation to Samantha, but it was after her death. And we identified that there was then a possible lack of recognition by services at an earlier stage that coercive controlling behaviour was occurring. As you will know, coercive controlling behaviour is a criminal offence. It's a pattern of behaviour used by a person towards another person that's designed to exert power and control, and it causes that victim to fear violence or to experience serious alarm or distress that has a substantial effect on their day-to-day activities. It is often subtle. It often involves psychological tactics and manipulative behaviour. James coerced and controlled Samantha through various means. He restricted access to her finances. Her benefits were paid directly into his account, and he would spend all that money and give her a very, very small allowance. He attended appointments with her, and where he didn't attend appointments with her, he would wait outside until she had finished. And he supplied her with and administered drugs to her. There were also reports of physical assaults and psychological abuse that was disclosed by Samantha. And there was also suggestion that James utilised his father to exert that coercion and control. This made Samantha entirely reliant and dependent upon James, and obviously made that it really difficult for her to leave, let alone seek any support. Oh, apologies. Just go back. Coercive and controlling behaviour had been acknowledged at the MARAC that was held in January 24, but it wasn't recorded or investigated as a crime at that time. And throughout the remainder of those 2 years, coercive and controlling behaviour wasn't explicitly recognised, acknowledged or responded to. And as I said, it suggested a possible lack of confidence in this area, and particularly around the challenges around pursuing a victimless prosecution, where Samantha wasn't supporting the police in taking that forward. So moving on to carers who cause harm. As I said, James was considered to be Samantha's carer. He called himself her carer, and she referred to him as her carer. The agencies working with Samantha were aware that he was a carer from at least January 2024, when that information was shared at the MARAC. But the definition of a carer is really broad and vague. The Care Act simply states that a carer is an adult who provides or intends to provide care for another adult. James was also in receipt of carer's allowance. To be eligible for carer's allowance, a person must be providing at least 35 hours of care a week. The carer must not be earning more than £196 a week after tax. And the cared for person must be in receipt of one of the qualifying benefits. And the type of care being provided can include things like helping someone to wash, helping them to cook, taking them to appointments, helping with household tasks, managing bills, doing shopping, and so on. However, there is no evidence that James provided any such support to Samantha. To the contrary, she often presented as unkempt and was described as self-neglecting. She lived in a property that reportedly had no hot water and no heatings. The conditions were described by professionals that were able to gain access as squalid. And as I previously said, James spent all of Samantha's money. But just in relation to the provision of carer's allowance, we found that there was an assumption by other agencies that due diligence had been undertaken by the DWP in awarding carer's allowance, and that there had been some degree of assessment of his caring role. But it's really clear to say that the DWP do not undertake any formal checks in respect of care that's being reportedly provided. The only check that they make is to see whether the person that's being cared for is receiving one of the qualifying disability benefits. They may also write to the cared for person to ask them if the care that is being provided is not taking place. Obviously, knowing what we know about Samantha, she wouldn't be disclosing that James was being neglectful of her. Local authority carers assessments, for example, they don't form any part of the carer allowance claim process. But where the DWP are alerted to any potential issues, they will consider appropriate action as far as the benefit claim is concerned, but no more. So James's role as carer for Samantha was very much overlooked in this case. Agencies said that they were really unclear about the nature of his caring role and the support that he provided. There was no carer's assessment offered or undertaken, but then it's unlikely that James would have engaged in that process. But nonetheless, an understanding of his caring role would have supported the agencies to challenge him in that role and identify neglect. Ultimately, being a carer can give somebody complete control over the person that they care for. Not only the person, but their resources. And it creates a clear power imbalance and dependency upon the carer, and can even lead to isolation. But domestic abuse by carers often goes unnoted due to that trust that has been placed in the caregiving relationship. But despite that, there's an increasing number of reviews that are coming to light which feature carers and caring responsibilities. And in the latest analysis of domestic abuse related death reviews, 14% of perpetrators were or had been carers. Recent research has also stated that the issue of carers as perpetrators of domestic abuse is overlooked, perhaps because they don't often fit that traditional pattern of domestic abusive relationships, and the complexity of the caring role can make standard interventions unsuitable. Moving on to making decisions and Samantha's ability to make decisions, which I think is a a really interesting aspect of the findings of this review. So as we know, mental capacity under the Mental Capacity Act refers to a person's ability to make informed decisions for themselves. A person has capacity if they can understand the relevant information, they can retain that information long enough to make the decision, they can weigh up the pros and cons in order to reach a conclusion, and they can express that decision, whether that be through the spoken word, through writing, or any other means. But we also know that mental capacity can be compromised, and that can be compromised through conditions such as dementia, a learning disability, a mental health condition, a brain injury, but it can also be compromised by intoxication from drugs and alcohol. That can either be long-term or short-term, but on the flip side of that, also being intoxicated does not automatically mean that we lack capacity. And we also know that from the Mental Capacity Act, the starting assumption is that a person has mental capacity. And I think the review identified whether there was an over-reliance on that presumption of capacity. If there's a reasonable belief that someone might lack capacity to make a specific decision, then that is your trigger to undertake a mental capacity assessment. And then if it's found that the person lacks capacity, a best interest decision is made on their behalf. Samantha's capacity was only formally assessed once during the 2-year period, and that was in relation to her refusing treatment in hospital. That assessment found that she had capacity to make that decision. So no other agencies formally assessed Samantha's mental capacity to make a decision, despite the fact that she frequently presented under the influence of drugs. Of course, we can't retrospectively say or assess Samantha's capacity at specific points in time in the 2 years leading to her death in relation to the various specific decisions that she was presented with. But there certainly was a reasonable belief that she may have lacked capacity. Interestingly, the House of Lords Select Committee did a post-legislative scrutiny of the Mental Capacity Act back in 2014. And they said that the presumption of capacity, in particular, is widely misunderstood by those involved in care. It's sometimes used to support non-intervention or poor care, leaving vulnerable adults exposed to a risk of harm. In some cases, this is because professionals struggle to understand how to apply the principle in practice. But in other cases, the evidence suggests that the principle has been deliberately misappropriated to avoid taking responsibility for a vulnerable adult. 6 years later, in an employment appeal tribunal case, Judge Swift said that the presumption of capacity is important. It ensures proper respect for personal autonomy by requiring any decision as to a lack of capacity to be based on evidence. Yet that Section 1 presumption, like any other, has logical limits. When there is good reason for cause for concern, where there is a legitimate doubt as to capacity, the presumption cannot be used to avoid taking responsibility for assessing and determining capacity. To do that would be to fail to respect personal autonomy in a different way. So I think that case gives a really important message about the presumption of capacity and the importance of not being over reliant on that presumption, and being curious as to whether someone may lack capacity. Again, I've provided some links to some commentary around the presumption of capacity in the resources section. But what happens when somebody does have the capacity to make a decision? What if there's no disturbance of the mind or brain? The Mental Capacity Act doesn't apply. People's ability to make decisions can still be compromised. That can be as a result of coercion or undue influence. And there was certainly evidence to suggest that Samantha's decision-making was compromised in that way. So if not by an impairment of the mind or brain arising from use of substances, by the coercion and control that was being exerted by James. So in cases where the Mental Capacity Act doesn't apply, we have the inherent jurisdiction, which could be considered. The inherent jurisdiction refers to the power of the High Court to make decisions and orders in situations where there's no other statutory duty that exists, but where intervention is necessary to protect individuals, especially those that are vulnerable. The High Court can issue a range of orders that can include preventing contact with a harmful person. And so it's an option that could have been considered in Samantha's case, obviously following multi-agency discussion and legal advice. It's very much considered a last resort. But Samantha's lived experience is also a really important factor to consider in terms of her ability to make decisions. She had experienced trauma as a child through various adverse childhood experiences. She had been in relationship with James from quite a young age, and it's highly likely that she had very little or no experience of making decisions for herself. Even if she had capacity to do so, she just may not have had that opportunity, and she still required that support from others in order to make decisions. And that leads us on quite nicely to think about trauma-informed approaches. So Samantha's engagement with services was a really significant theme in this review. She often didn't attend appointments. She declined services and support that was made available to her. And it was always really difficult to make contact with her. James would take Samantha's phone. He would answer it when it rang. And there was also reports of professionals phoning Samantha's phone to then hear a voicemail for James on the other end. Professionals also commented that they found it really challenging because Samantha would often change her mind. And that was especially around offers of alternative housing or refuge. She herself referenced quite a lot about her struggles to access her community pharmacy, which she attended daily. She was not assigned a pharmacy, the closest pharmacy to her, and so was accessing a pharmacy that was quite a distance for her to get to. This was because the one nearest to her, or at least two pharmacies closer to her, she'd been banned from due to shoplifting and verbal aggression. Other pharmacies were full to capacity and said they were unable to accommodate managing her prescription. And so this was a real clear barrier to her engaging in prescribed treatment. And she commented on how challenging she found that. The police also commented that they found it difficult to engage Samantha, and that substance misuse was a real barrier for them in gaining coherent reports from her. But they did try their utmost to tailor responses to Samantha's needs, ensuring that they had face-to-face contact with her away from her address, and jumping onto pre-planned meetings that had been arranged with Samantha by other agencies. But there were other examples where we could see that engagement wasn't being supported as well as it could be, where there was little consideration of Samantha's needs. So there's an example where there had been a disclosure of abuse which Samantha wasn't engaging with, and the police put the onus on her to make a report at a later date if she wanted to. That would have been clearly difficult for Samantha to do. As the police described it, she led a chaotic lifestyle. She used substances. The investigation being undertaken by police was subsequently closed due to non-contact, which was likely and could have been anticipated. And they sent a letter to her to let her know that the investigation was being closed if they didn't hear back from her within a few days. There was no consideration of the fact of whether Samantha was even able to read a letter or understand what was being written to her. And there was no consideration of the possibility of someone else intercepting that letter and Samantha even getting it at all. There were some really good examples of agencies persevering with that engagement with Samantha, keeping cases open longer than the remit of the agency would usually dictate. There were groups of agencies that set up communication channels so that they could share information about who had had contact with Samantha and when, and they arranged joint appointments, so Samantha only had to go to somewhere once to meet with 3 agencies. But the agencies reflected that even with all those measures, there continued to be barriers for Samantha in accessing services. There are a number of causes for those barriers. That included living with addiction, her unmanaged health needs, and her experience of mental health issues and her experiences of domestic abuse. And as we know, trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening, and they're unique to the individual. Generally, that experience of trauma can have a long-lasting effect. It can limit someone's ability to function and achieve mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And as you well know, trauma-informed practice aims to increase practitioners' awareness of how trauma can negatively impact on individuals, can impact on their ability to feel safe or to develop trusting relationships. And so it aims to improve the accessibility and quality of services by being culturally sensitive and safe and trusting and services that people want to use. Trauma-informed practice acknowledges the need to see beyond an individual's presenting behaviours and to ask, what does this person need, rather than what is wrong with this person? And with specific reference to domestic abuse, it's possible that Samantha didn't recognise herself as a victim. Many victims of domestic abuse do not immediately recognise that they're being abused. And that's especially prominent in cases where there's emotional, psychological, economic or abuse or controlling behaviours, even though the legal definition of domestic abuse covers all that broad range of harmful actions. It was interesting because Samantha often denied experiencing different types of abuse, particularly coercive and controlling behaviour, but would then go on to describe behaviour by James, which was clearly coercive, controlling and abusive. So it just highlighted maybe that lack of understanding by Samantha. In undertaking the review, it became clear that there were missed opportunities to work with Samantha and to fully comprehend her lived experience and trauma, and how that might have affected her ability to access and engage with services. There were missed opportunities to identify barriers and how those barriers could have been minimised or removed for her. So they're all the findings from the review. Just a note in terms of recommendations. So when we looked at making recommendations based on the findings of this review, we were really cautious that we didn't want to repeat or replicate any work that was already being undertaken locally, or to repeat any recommendations that have been made in recent domestic abuse related death reviews or safeguarding adult reviews. So just to give you a bit of background or some examples of some work that's ongoing before I take you into the recommendations that were made. Cumberland Community Safety Partnership had already identified some immediate thematic learning from other recent domestic abuse related death reviews, which were similar to those arising in Samantha's case. And they broadly included things around improving professional curiosity and routine inquiry, multi-agency involvement and information sharing, assessing and managing risk, handovers and step downs, typologies, links between domestic abuse and substance use, working in line with the Victims Code of 2021, and learning and development. And in response to this, there have been learning events that have been rolled out Cumbria-wide addressing these issues, and resources for further learning, an amendment of practice in each area have been provided. We've had partner audits being piloted in relation to MARAT cases, with a plan to widen scope in order to gauge the impact of the identified learning improvement and embedding in practice. Cumbria Safeguarding Adult Boards are also seeking assurance through their practice and quality assurance subgroup, using a case file audit process of other safeguarding inquiries. A session was also delivered in November 24 regarding the wider interpretation of safeguarding and how care and support needs can be interpreted for legal literacy. There was also a recommendation made as a result of a thematic self-neglect safeguarding adult review, which was to explore the use of electronic safeguarding referrals, which might assist in greater detail being shared in respect of a person's potential care and support needs. There was also learning from the joint domestic abuse related death review and safeguarding adult review for Jessica. This led to measures to increase practitioner understanding and awareness of coercive controlling behaviour, and also resulted in a Mental Capacity Act week of action, which included lunch and learn sessions like this one, and daily briefings. The Cumberland Council Public Health team are also investigating mechanisms to ensure that adverse childhood experiences are considered and interventions are trauma informed and best support those with experiences like Samantha. I believe at the time of writing, a language guide was in development, which aims to address the use of language, moving from using language such as refuses to engage, to transform that into a more trauma-informed light to better understand a person's individual circumstances. So, on to the recommendations made by this review. The first one was for adult social care to develop guidance on the use of inherent jurisdiction and to share that with partners of both the Safeguarding Adult Board and Community Safety Partnership. We also asked that the Safeguarding Adult Board and Community Safety Partnership develop and cascade a learning briefing specifically around informal carers who cause harm, and that will include what the role of the DWP is, and the role of banks in cases of financial abuse. As I'd said in when talking about the findings, all of Samantha's benefits went into James's account, and he entirely managed the money that she received. So it's really important to have that guidance around the bank's role in those cases, as well as the DWP. And then we asked that all agencies provide assurances that they were taking a proactive approach to safety planning, particularly during those times of service pressure, so Christmas, New Year and Easter. And the final recommendation was that the Safeguarding Adult Board and Community Safety Partnership consider the learning from this review and the recurring themes that that we've seen in the various DARDRs and SARs, and to evaluate the effectiveness of recommendations from those previous reviews, and that's in respect of these following areas of learning: identifying care and support needs, coercive and controlling behaviour, mental capacity, informal carers, trauma-informed approaches and multi-agency approaches. And so we've asked for an evaluation and whether there's further action that's required in relation to those themes. And finally, just in terms of some references and resources before I stop talking, give myself a breath and let you ask any questions that you have. The first 3 bullet points, which is a learning briefing on Samantha, which is quite quick and easy to read. If you wanted to get into the greater detail of the review, the second bullet point is the link to the full Safeguarding Adult Review report. And then there's also the link to the trauma-informed resources on Cumbria's CSAB website. So they're all on Cumbria's CSAB website. If you want to go and have a look, have a good old read of the full overview report. Then there are 3 links to some Safe Lives material. First, we have the resources for professionals on undertaking a DASH risk assessment, where it talks there about that visible risk and the use of professional judgment. There's the guidance around managing cases with complex needs at MARAC. And then there's one of their focus editions around disabled, entitled Disabled Survivors too. And it just gives a bit more insight, I think, into those carer cared for relationships for people who have various disabilities. So maybe of interest in the context of Samantha. I've got links to the Serious Crime Act, which created coercive controlling behaviour as a criminal offence, and then the Domestic Abuse Act 21, which strengthened that offence. And there's sections there, section 76 and 68. There's then a piece of research called Carers and Domestic Abuse, the Elephant in the Room, which is a really interesting read if you can get access to it. It's not always easy to get full access to journal articles, but that talks about those difficulties arising around carers and domestic abuse. And then the last two links are around the presumption of capacity, available on the Mental Capacity Law and Policy website, which is a really useful website for all things mental capacity. So yeah, do take a look at those if you're particularly interested in that.